when healthy, a good fighter. The problem with Swick is he's just never very healthy. But as far as how the fight's going to play out, we will be previewing that as we do here at 5 Star Radio in the future. But, just quick thoughts. Hardy is good on his feet. I don't think he's so great that he's going to screw with Swick. I think Swick's much better on the ground. I think Swick's wrestling may even be good enough to get it down there. But it could be an explosive, entertaining, fun fight. You know what? For everybody's sake, all the listeners and viewers out there, I'm hoping so at least. And then we get one from Hardcore Hogan. Hardcore Hogan. It's a good man. He writes in, what about a fight between Anderson Silva and Mirko Cro Cop at heavyweight? Or I guess one could ask it light heavyweight. Interesting? What do you think? Well, there was a time when I actually think that would have been a good fight to make. Right now, I think Cro Cop is such damaged goods that you just can't risk him beating Anderson Silva. And he could. I mean, Cro Cop, for all of his faults, he's still got something, he lasted as long as he did with Junior Dos Santos. Regardless of how you think he looked in that fight, the fact is that he lasted longer than Verdum and Stefan Struve. I mean, I know we're playing MMA math there, but he still showed something. About 1/20th of what Cro Cop had in his prime, but still something there. And, if he first was to get his shit together for that one fight and knock out Anderson Silva, I don't know if that would really be worth it. I think that Cro Cop has done so much damage to his legacy right now that he really needs, 2 or 3 rehab fights. And he'd need 2 or 3 impressive wins in a row before the UFC fans started believing in him again. This is a guy who had all the hype in the world behind him. Pretty much the poster boy for products of Japan failing in America is Mirko Cro Cop. I mean, when people talk about how it's a different game in Japan, the drug testing, the weight cutting, and all this stuff is different in the cage versus ring, and blah blah blah, and being fed tomato cans and all that jazz. It's Mirko Cro Cop that they almost always have in the back of their mind. And this is a guy that was coming off the high point of his career, knocking out Wanderlei Silva and Josh Barnett in the first round in the same night, 2 fights, winning the 2006 Pride Openweight Grand Prix. He shows up in the UFC with all the fanfare in the world. I mean, this guy was looked at as the dude. It was going to be Mirko Cro Cop, heavyweight star. He was going to carry the UFC heavyweight division. He was going to be their ace, their stud fighter. He fought Eddie Sanchez. Looked kind of crappy, but you thought, you know what? Sanchez made it a bad fight, And then we saw the Gonzaga fight. And then we saw the Czech Congo fight. He returns to Mustafa Al-Turk. The thumb to the eye. Questions arise. Then Junior Dos Santos. I mean, he's lost 3 of his last 4 fights in the UFC. He has never looked good inside the octagon. I think his reputation has been so damaged, so battered, so beaten down, that UFC fans do not see him as an elite level talent. And I think Anderson Silva, the guy's never been hotter. He is at the peak of his entire life. There's like, Anderson Silva got married. Anderson Silva had children. Then Anderson Silva is, in 2009, the greatest fighter on the planet. The UFC billed him as pound for pound best. He goes out, massacres Forrest Griffin. Stylistic matchup that favored him or not. He still absolutely decimated the former light heavyweight champion of the world. A man who was 1 fight removed from being the light heavyweight champion of the world. He made Forrest look like an amateur. And that is no exaggeration. That is not hyperbole. Forrest Griffin looked on that night that he did not belong in the cage with Anderson Silva. And so Anderson Silva's the man. He is a prize. Beating Anderson Silva in and of itself is like winning a title. Some guys work hard and some guys have to work in order to earn a title shot. Honestly, I think there's some guys, and Anderson Silva is probably number 1 amongst these, you have to work just for the opportunity to beat this man. Because beating Silva is going to be something that will be an instant credibility maker. And I don't know if you want to waste that on Cro Cop. I mean, setting aside that I don't know if people will buy it. I don't know how much legs he's got. So I like the idea. And if Cro Cop wasn't so damaged, I think it would be dynamic and an excellent fight. It would be the greatest, you have Anderson Silva, the most dynamic, excellent, and greatest striker right now. Making a case for the greatest striker of all time in MMA. Versus Mirko Cro Cop, the standard bearer. The greatest striker we'd ever seen. The man who truly reinvented striking in MMA. Who made people shake at the idea of what he would do. who, when you were standing with Cro Cop in his prime, it was an inevitability that he was not going to just beat you. He was going to hurt you. He didn't just knock people out. He knocked them literally unconscious. They would be carried away. They would be doubled over in pain if he hit you in the liver. He shortened careers. That was the Cro Cop in the prime. So I could understand the appeal, the draw of those two going at it, those titans of industry, facing off against one another. I just don't think that it's quite there anymore because of Cro Cop's precipitous fall from grace. But I like the idea nonetheless. Lest? I don't know. We're at 15 minutes, folks. Tima writes in and asks, do you think UFC champions have an advantage over their opponents, and that they get to choose when they fight to a large degree, and unless their opponent is on the same fight cycle as them, as the champion, that is a massive help at times? Well, I thank you, Timmy, and I understand where you're coming from, and I do understand that line of thinking, and there may be some validity to it. However, I think it may actually be the opposite. I think that when you're a champion, you are more often than not called upon by the UFC on kind of quote-unquote short notice to fill a pay-per-view main event. You know, take a Brock Lesnar and a Shane Carwin. Now, don't get me wrong. You're offered a shot at the title, you're pretty much going to take it. But if you're Brock Lesnar, the UFC's calling you like, look, we got nothing for November. We need a main event. We know you only got 8 weeks, but come on. Give us a show. Best example of that is Quentin Jackson. This past March, when he fought Keith Jardine, called upon on short notice, and the UFC's like, look, Quentin, we're desperate. We need a main event for the Columbus show. If you don't do this, we are literally going to be headlining with Shane Carwin and Gabriel Gonzaga. We will do 412 buys, because that's the number of bars in the surrounding area. And by the way, Columbus, Ohio, the area around the Nationwide Arena, very, very nice. I give the 5-star radio thumbs up. But so I think you see the champions, and in particular like those upper echelon stars who are really kind of interchangeable. I mean, to me there's no difference between Brock Lesnar and Randy Couture or Quentin Jackson and Lyoto Machida. I mean, it's not about champions so much for me as it is, you know, big stars can kind of call their own shots. And sometimes they do get the opportunity to say no. But, you know, if you're somebody that is, as Tim is pointing out, his opponents, not just anybody, but their opponents. If you're at the level where you're going to be challenging a champion, usually you can be like, look, can I just have a couple weeks or whatever? I mean, you're at the level where you can tell the UFC, I can't fight on that date. Now, you may miss your title shot, but you're still going to be fighting the UFC. And what's more is, unlike Pride in particular, or Japan in general, I mean, we saw this past weekend when Kazushi Sakuraba fought, this past Tuesday, I should say, on like a day and a half notice against a boxer. And luckily took the guy down and tapped him out with Kimura, thankful. But nonetheless, I mean, that's the shit you see in Japan. Whereas in the United States, we've known about Lyoto Machida and Shogun Rua officially for several months. Unofficially for probably half a year almost. I mean, Shane Carwin and Brock Lesnar, it's early October. That's mid to late November. We've known about that fight. Those two have been talking trash about each other for a month. So you know that fight's happening. We already know about Anderson Silva versus Vitor Belfort in January. And St. Pierre knows he's probably fighting late January or February. I mean, we generally know when these guys are going to be fighting. I mean, the shortest notice main event that I can think of recently, setting aside Keith Jardine and Quentin Jackson, which even that was 6 or 7 weeks, is the upcoming Randy Couture versus Brandon Vera fight. I mean, those guys are in kind of short notice, and not just short notice, but short notice on a quick turnaround from an August fight. So is there potential? I mean, I get the idea of a fight cycle, but, you know, maybe. But I think really at the end of the day, if there is any advantage, it's negligible. I think there's probably just as many disadvantages with these guys as there are advantages. And most importantly, almost always when it comes to a title fight, the UFC is giving guys 8 to 10 weeks notice as a minimum. I'm sure they get even more than that. Look at George St. Pierre and Thiago Alves. Those guys had 6 months notice, 5 months notice, 6 months notice there. I mean, they knew who they were fighting. More often than not, I think the champions and challengers in UFC title fights are pretty aware of when they're going to be fighting, who they're going to be fighting, where they're going to be fighting, and all that jazz. So possibly, but probably probably a bit overblown, probably not the biggest deal.